So, namaskar and good evening, fellow members of IIC, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the D.S. Borker Memorial Foundation, welcome to the annual seminar on keys to governance. The topic for 2026 is of course, economic justice. We have a distinguished panel of speakers today. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Emeritus, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, CESP JNU. Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, USA, and member of the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality, appointed by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, established under South Africa's 2025 presidency. Dr. Lucas Chancel, co-director of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics. And Lucas joins us from Paris. Thank you very much. And yours truly, Suhas Borker, shall moderate the discussion. For some housekeeping, the discussion is for 90 minutes. Each speaker gets 15 to 20 minutes, which takes us past 7. After that, we open the discussion to a Q&A session. At the end, each panelist gets 2 minutes for concluding remarks. We close at 7:30 p.m. This is the 11th edition of the seminars on keys to governance in honor of my elder brother, Shekhar Borker, banana boy on the Indian postage stamp. The stamp was issued to commemorate Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's birthday in 1957 as the first Children's Day. He was a private sector administrator, citizen environmentalist, advocate of empowerment of persons with disabilities, and a senior member of IIC who passed away in 2015, today, 7th of January. The earlier 10 seminars in the series Keys to Governance were on Compliance and Delivery 2016, Political Will 2017, Constitution as Ideology 2018, Education as Empowerment 2019, Steel Frame 2020, I missed out one, Education as Empowerment 2019, Independence of Judiciary 2021, Constitutional Morality 2022, Social and Communal Harmony 2023, Free, Pluralistic and Independent Media 2024, and last year we had Consensus in Foreign Policy 2025. For 2 years, due to the COVID pandemic, we were on webinar mode, but in 2023, we resumed the physical meetings with a technological add-on of webcasting live. Today's meeting is live on the YouTube channel CFTV News Reports, where it shall also be archived, be viewed anytime on call. We now present Angavastrams to our speakers. These Angavastrams come from artisans in Salem in Tamil Nadu, and they are called Ganga Jamuna and represent a pluralistic tradition. Sudha, can you present to Professor Prabhat? I'll do the honors, Jayati. And Lucas, your Angavastram is here when you come next to New Delhi. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
So we shall now request the speakers to light the lamp. If you can just a minute, yeah. Now we move to today's topic, keys to governance, economic justice. Economic justice is a core constitutional commitment in India, which is absolutely neglected, though it is enshrined in the preamble of the Constitution and the directive principles of state policy, which direct the state to minimize inequality, ensure equitable resource distribution, and prevent wealth concentration. It has been reduced to a mere tokenism. As a recent report of the World Inequality Lab and database points out, in India between 2014-15 and 2022 and 23, the rise of top-end inequality has been particularly pronounced in terms of wealth concentration. By 22-23, top 1% of income and wealth shares are at their highest historical levels, and India's top 1% income share is among the very highest in the world, higher than even South Africa, Brazil, and US. The 2026 report of the World Inequality Lab, the key findings: top 10% earn 58% of India's income, bottom 50% earn only 15%. And the wealth inequality is even worse. The top 10% hold 65% of total wealth, and top 1% hold around 40% of all wealth. Bottom 50% hold only tiny shares. Female labor participation, there's been no improvement in the last decade, 15.7%. So we'll, without further ado, I'll request Professor Prabhat Patnaik to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I feel privileged to be part of this panel. I also feel extremely privileged to be a part of this series of conversations, which have been going on now for several years. As Mr. Borker said, India today is among the most unequal societies anywhere in the world. And what is more, this inequality is growing. This inequality has grown tremendously during the period of the neoliberal economic reforms. As a matter of fact, while we have the World Inequality Database co-chairman, co-director, as one of the panelists, and I'm sure he'll give you the figures, in around the time of independence, let's say the proportion of total national income, which accrued to the top 1% of the population, was about 12%. This declined to about 6% by 1982. And since then, it has increased to a historically high level of almost 23%, according to the latest count. But while the increase in inequality is well accepted and documented, less agreement is there on the increase in absolute poverty. In fact, if you look at the media, the impression that is created is that India is virtually witnessing the end of absolute poverty. That it's about 5%, extreme poverty affects only 5% of the population and so on. As a matter of fact, in 1973-74, when poverty studies began in India, the definition of poverty, according to the Planning Commission, was anyone who did not have access to 2100 calories per person per day in urban India and 2200 calories per person per day in rural India. Now, if you take that measure as the standard measure of poverty accepted by the Indian Planning Commission as it existed then there has been an increase in the magnitude of absolute poverty both in urban and rural India during this period of neoliberal reforms. As a matter of fact, in 1993-94, the proportion of the rural population that did not have access to 2200 calories per person per day was 58%, which has increased by 2011-12 to 68% and 2017-18 to over 80%. At which point, as you know, the government of India decided to withdraw the NSS data from the public and change the method of data collection, because of which subsequent years are difficult to compare with 2017-18. Similarly, if you look at urban India, the proportion of population below 2100 calories per person per day was 57% in 1993-94, and it increased to 65% in 2011-12 and remained roughly there around 2017-18. So by the strict notion of poverty as defined by the Planning Commission originally, in India there has been an increase in poverty in nutritional terms. Of course, this is something which gets camouflaged because the government of India decided to change the way of measuring poverty. They actually took that level of expenditure at which people accessed these particular calorie norms as the poverty line, and subsequently have brought up that poverty line in accordance with the consumer price index. The problem with the consumer price index is that, being a last peer index, it is based on base year weights which are more than 50 years out of date. As a matter of fact, for instance, the privatization of education and the privatization of healthcare is something that has greatly increased the cost of education and healthcare for the bulk of the population, but on the other hand, it does not get captured in the last peer price index, last peer consumer price index, which therefore understates the magnitude of inflation and therefore understates the poverty line and therefore understates the magnitude of poverty. So it is not just a matter of inequality, it's also a matter of an increase in poverty, at least defined in nutritional terms. And there are lots of other indices to support this. For instance, the extent of anemia among Indian women is something which has actually been increasing, all of which really show that there is a worsening in the situation as far as the bulk of the population is concerned, even though we start talking about the increase in the GDP growth rate. But the point is that an increase in GDP growth rate is something which is perfectly compatible with an increase in the magnitude of absolute poverty, for a very simple reason, namely that if, along with the increase in growth rate, there is an increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity, which arises for a number of reasons, which I'll come to. In that case, since the rate of growth of employment is just the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity, even if you have an 8% growth rate of GDP, if you have a 7% rate of growth of labor productivity, and the rate of growth of employment is just about 1%. While earlier you may have had a lower rate of growth of GDP, but you also had a lower rate of growth of labor productivity, because of which the rate of growth of employment was, if anything, somewhat higher than it is today, which basically implies that today, despite a slowing down of the population and therefore the workforce growth rate, you would find that the magnitude of labor reserves are much greater. The labor reserves in India do not take the form of open unemployment, takes the form of work sharing, so that each has less amount of work, less number of days of work than and I mean, as time goes, the increase in the magnitude of labor reserves takes the form of each having a lower number of days of work, because of which the incomes are lower, and with the incomes being lower and the consumer price index rising because of privatization and so on, you would find that the magnitude of poverty has actually increased. It's in the light of this that many people have suggested that there should be a universal basic income. The problem with the universal basic, Arvind Subramaniam, for instance, mentioned in the economic survey, but the problem with the universal basic income is that, firstly, that it is supposed to be basically based on a transfer. Now, the magnitude of transfer is something that would depend on the fiscal situation of the government at the time, and it's perfectly possible that with the fiscal situation becoming tighter, the government can reduce the magnitude of transfers and claim that they are still meeting the basic minimum norms. Secondly, it appears as a kind of largesse on the part of the government that, okay, the government is actually doing something for the poor, and that therefore the poor should be implicitly grateful to the government for doing this. And thirdly, it is something also which is essentially targeted, which basically means, as with any targeted schemes, some deserving people are bound to get left out. Uh, as you know, even with the targeted public distribution system in the Dharavi slums, there are only about 150 ration card holders, so which is quite amazing, but it is inevitable in any kind of targeted scheme. So I believe that the way to overcome the worsening poverty and to make it, enjoin upon the government to do something about it and to give the recipients the dignity of being citizens of India, we should institute a set of fundamental economic rights like we have fundamental civil and political rights. These fundamental rights, we made some calculations. If you take just 5 fundamental rights, one is the right to food, which basically means that everybody should have the same right to food as the BPL population had before the pandemic. Secondly, a right to employment in the sense that either you get employment, or if the state cannot provide you with employment, in that case you get a full wage in lieu of being denied work. Thirdly, a right to free, quality, publicly funded education, at least up to the higher secondary level. Fourth, a right to free, universal health care, quality, publicly provided health care through a national health service. And fifth, the right to a living pension and disability benefits. By a living pension, I mean that currently, for instance, central government scheme gives 200 rupees a month, which is a joke. But by a living pension, I mean we had calculated 3,000 rupees per month, but actually it can be a lot more now. But if you had, yeah, but if you do institute all these 5 fundamental economic rights, then by our calculations, you would require, in addition to what is already being spent on these heads, which is about 6% of GDP, an additional 10% of GDP. In other words, you'd require about 16% of GDP in order to finance these 5 fundamental economic rights. Now, in order to spend an additional 10% of GDP, you don't have to mobilize taxes to the extent of additional 10% of GDP. quite apart from the fact that some of these rights would automatically overlap. I mean, for instance, if you're building schools because you are providing a universal right to education, in that case, to some extent, employment would be generated anyway. But even leaving that aside, in order to finance an additional 10% of expenditure, you require less than 10% because some of the amount you spend comes back to the government as taxes and can be respent. So if you take that into account on very conservative estimates, you'd require about 6 2/3 percent of GDP as additional fresh taxation. These taxes can be raised by our calculation by just two taxes levied on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax, the other is, in fact, a 1/3 inheritance tax. It is absolutely shocking that in India we do not have any inheritance tax because it is a commonly accepted phenomenon that even those who are defenders of capitalism argue that, look, the capitalists earn an income because they have some talent. Fine, let us accept it. But their children must demonstrate that same talent to be able to be entitled to be earning an income. But if you have inheritance, inherited wealth being passed on, then that goes against the very fundamental principle that capitalism is based on by the defenders of the system itself. It's shocking that we don't have any inheritance tax. And the wealth tax that in fact, which is why inheritance tax in the form of death duties is much larger, pretty large in a lot of the advanced capitalist countries. Japan has 55% death duty. Britain and the US have about 40% death duty, while we are suggesting only a very modest 1/3 inheritance tax, which means not just at the time of death, but even otherwise, if you pass on some property, then 1/3 of it should actually be taken over by the state. The 2% wealth tax we are suggesting is something which is extremely moderate in terms of what was being suggested, for instance, in the United States during the election, in which, for instance, Bernie Sanders had suggested a graduated wealth tax where the highest was 7% wealth tax. The lowest was about 1%. But that was for everybody. We are just talking about only top 1%. Similarly, Elizabeth Warren, who was another candidate for presidentship against Joe Biden, had suggested two kind of slabs. One is 1% and 2%, and the 2% wealth tax she had suggested really covered a much wider range of the population than the top 1% of the population that we are arguing should be targeted. So, in terms of financial resources, our country is very well endowed to institute a set of fundamental economic rights. Unfortunately, in our constitution at the time when it was enacted, the basic economic rights and issues of economic justice were put to the directive principles of state policy. But I think the time has come for us to kind of, extract them from there and to institute a set of fundamental economic rights, in which case no government can actually have the temerity to kind of do away with these rights, which would be constitutionally enshrined. So the question of economic justice now has acquired an absolute priority for reasons that Mr. Borker mentioned, for reasons which I just very briefly mentioned. And in view of this, it is absolutely essential that something be done about it, and this something be done about it should not take the form of transfers for which the people are supposed to be grateful to the government, but in fact, the institution of a set of rights where the dignity of citizenship is something which is acquired by the people who are at the receiving end. These are all universal rights. There's no question of some people being favored and some people not being kind of allowed to enjoy them and so on and so forth. So this is something which I think has now come onto the agenda of economic justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik, for putting things on the table so cogently. Now we go over to Lucas. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Let me try to share with you a few slides, which I will not use them all, but I will just try to illustrate some of the key points of my intervention. And I'm wondering whether you're seeing my slides.
Can you make it full screen?
Yes. Here we go. So what I wanted to do in the 15 minutes that I have, this is correct, Suhas?
You can go up to 20, that's okay.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what I'm going to do in the 15 to 20 minutes that I have is to present a few key results from this new report that we have released with the World Inequality Lab, and we were very much honored to have a foreword signed by Jayati Ghosh speaking here today, as well as Joseph Stiglitz. And this report was coordinated by myself, as well as Ricardo Gomez Carrera, Raida Moshrif, Thomas Piketty, and is based on the work of over 200 researchers over the world, some of them in India, some of them in on all continents, contributing to the World Inequality database. And after I do this global picture, this global perspective, I'll come to inequality numbers for India and what they mean from the perspective of economic policy, of democracy, and you'll see that there is a lot of things in commons that I share with what Professor Patnaik has just said and discussed. So I will skip many slides in this discussion. This is what I've been talking about. The 200 researchers, really important here. I'm stressing this of collective work between researchers, also journalists, especially in a moment when official statistics, public statistics in many countries are harder and harder to access because not all governments enjoy and like transparency when it comes to data, because sometimes data reveals things that are not so good. And I think this is in part what we're seeing in India from the perspective of inequality, of poverty in particular. So this report is available online. It's open access. We really try to make up for this lack of transparency related to economic data around the world. This is a QR code. You can access it also through the address that is written down there here, or just type World Inequality Report 2026 on your favorite web search engine. I'm not going to look at all the sections of the report, but I just wanted to show you that it's the goal of this report is really to look at inequalities from a broad perspective. We look at economic inequality in terms of income and wealth at the global level, but also at the regional level. We look at historical trends. We also look at gender inequalities, at environmental inequalities. And I was there in Delhi a few weeks ago, and I can only share my empathy with you all in the midst of this huge pollution in Delhi, which indeed is another contributor to these socioeconomic inequalities that we are looking at, that we're analyzing. So we talk about environmental inequalities as well in this report, and inequalities and their relation with the political system, and how the wealthiest not only capture a part of the economy, but they're also able to capture a growing part of democracy, or of what is left of democracy, of the electoral system, through their campaign financing and through their financing of institutions, of the media, that is contributing to public debates in their favoring their interest. So I just wanted to show a few key graphs, and this is the one that I wanted to start with. This is the level of inequality at the global level in 2025. On the left-hand side, you have income inequalities, and on the right-hand side, you have wealth inequalities. The red bar is the top 10% of individuals at the global level, and you see that the top 10% make up about half, just a little bit more than half of all incomes in the world, whereas the poorest half of the world population make a little less than 10% of everything, of all incomes generated in the world. In a world of perfect equality, the bottom 50% would make 50% of all incomes, and the top 10% would make 10% of all incomes. In a world of perfect inequality, well, the bottom 50 would be at 0 and the top 10% would be at 100. So that's the income situation. Now for wealth, in fact, we see that we're actually closer to almost perfect inequality. The top 10% make 75%, own 75% of everything there is to own on this planet. Whereas the bottom 50% own just 2% of the total. So wealth situation is much starker than income. This is a well-known fact that we observe at the global level. We also observe this at the national level, and I'll come to India's statistics in just a few moments. But this is the picture today, and what is very important about our specific period of capitalism is that things are happening, action is taking place very quickly at the very, very top. So if what we see on this graph is two groups of the global population. The blue line is the bottom half of the world population. So you see in 2025, they own just 2% of the total. The pink line is the richest 56,000 adults. So why do we have 56,000 adults? Because this corresponds to the top 0.001% of the global adult population. And we see that their combined wealth has risen from 4% in the 2010s to 6% today. So collectively, they own 3 times what the entire bottom 50% of the population owns. So this is a population, 50,000 adults that can be fit in a relatively small stadium and that own 3 times whatever is owned by the bottom 50% of the population. So this is the rise of centimillionaires, of billionaires at the very, very top of the distribution. A lot of action is taking place at this level. And here's another way to look at what has been happening at the global level. This has been named the global elephant curve of inequality and growth. I'll go through it in simple terms. What you have on the horizontal axis, these are groups of the global wealth population. The poorest are on the left and the richest are on the right. And on the vertical axis, what you see here is the per adult growth rate in wealth. So if you're you are in the global middle class, so to say, so let's say, between groups 50 and 90, so that's the middle 40% of the global distribution, growth rates were between 3-4% on average per year between 1995 and 2025. What this picture tells us is about the average annual growth rate over this period of time of 30 years. But now look at the very right-hand side of the distribution. So the very, very rich, the top 0.1 or top 0.001%, or even the richest one out of 100 million people. So the top 50 individuals, the billionaires of the Forbes list, they've seen their wealth grow on average, net of inflation, at a rate of around 8% or more per year, 8% of more per year. This is extremely important to have this figure in mind when we're talking about wealth taxes, as Professor Patnaik was talking about just a few minutes before. Because what does it mean? If you tax wealth at 2% every year, and you have for the very, very rich, the billionaires, and you have a growth rate of wealth of 8% per year, this means that their wealth would still grow at 6% per year. So a 2% wealth tax is really, really, really a moderate fix to the problem. It's really not radical at all. It's extremely light because you would still have an extremely high growth of wealth at the top of the distribution with a 2% wealth tax, as compared to the growth rate of the rest of the population, as you can see on this graph. So that's, I think, a very important order of magnitude to have in mind. I'm going to skip these graphs, and I just would like to show two other important dimensions of the World Inequality Report and of the inequality discussion more broadly. That's gender inequality. And what we show is that women persistently receive lower labor incomes than men in all regions of the world. This is particularly stark in Southeast Asia and in India in particular, where you see that the female labor income share in a country like India is around 20%. If we were to reach gender parity, this should be 50%. And what you see there is that in European countries, for instance, the level is 40%. It's still not 50%, and we see little progress in the recent years. So that's the female labor income share, which really is this structural component of broader economic inequalities. And so gender inequality plays a key part in this global inequality of income as well as of wealth. And that's another way to look at this same problem. This is factoring in not just what women earn through paid work, but also factoring in the work done by women that is unpaid. So when we include domestic labor hours and domestic care, in fact, we see that women, on average, at the global level, that's the left-hand side graph in green and in red. You see women here, their average labor time in hours per week at the global level rises from 20 hours on average per week. So that's the market working time, to 53 hours if we include all domestic work. Whereas for men, these numbers rise from around 32 hours market to 43 hours when everything is taken into account. So this is going to further contribute to this huge inequality between women's hourly incomes expressed as a percentage of men's. So women's hourly income expressed as a percentage of men is 60%, more or less, when we exclude domestic work. And when we look at real actual work at the global level, women just earn 32% of what men earn out of an hour of actual real work. And so in the report, we also give details of these numbers by region. You look South and Southeast Asia, and at the country level, we have relatively similar figures compared to the one that I've just presented. For women, we see here that we rise from around 20 hours to actually over 60 hours of work per week on average. So this is another key dimension that we look at in the report. And I'll move to a third important dimension before moving and concluding on the Indian discussion. So carbon inequality, pollution inequality, they're tightly linked, tightly connected with income and wealth inequalities. Why? Well, because those who own the most, those who earn the most, those who consume the most, are those who pollute the most. This is true at the country level. When we look at different countries around the world, this is also true within countries. What's also true is that those who earn the least, who own the least, who consume the least, who pollute the least, are also the most impacted by environmental pollution, at least in relative terms. And this is what we show on this graph. So this is, again, a global picture. We, again, have three groups: the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, the top 10% of the world population. And what the colors relate to is different ways to think about this pollution and inequality nexus. So in green is the relative losses associated with climate change. So how much hit you perceive as an individual because of climate change. So how much climate change is going to affect your livelihood because it might destroy your crops, for instance, and this will reduce your incomes. And what we see here is that the bottom 50% of the world population is actually concentrating 3/4 of all these relative losses, relative income losses, how much you will feel the hit related to climate disasters or to rising temperatures. While the bottom 50% of the population contributes to just 10% of global emissions. And so that's the blue bars. And the red bars tell us an insight or a proxy for what capacity these different groups have in tackling climate change, in acting upon the problem and fixing it. And we see that here the proxy is the capacity to finance, and it's in fact the distribution of wealth, which I was referring to earlier, how much financial resources you have to address the problem. Well, the bottom 50%, just 2% of global wealth ownership, whereas the top 10% who face the least harms, who contribute the most to the problem, have the highest capacities to address it. So this is, again, very global picture, and we go much more into the details within the report. So those of you who are interested, I really invite you to have a look at the report where we also look at issues related to the international financial system and the international monetary system, and discuss options for reforming this system in a way that doesn't structurally works just for the global north. I will skip this, and I would like to move to the more country level focus. And so we're looking at India. Obviously, the top 10% income share is presented here. I will zoom in here because, in fact, in India, action is not happening at the level of the top 10, but it's happening at the level of the top 1, top 0.1, or even smaller groups at the very, very top when we think about action happening at the top. And this is actually drawn from another research done with Nitin Bhati, Thomas Piketty, and Anmol Somanchi. We released this work last year. We combine available data. As I said, it's hard to access this data, but actually we do have information. And we present new long-run income and wealth estimates of inequality. And what I wanted to show you here is that when you look at the top 1%, top 1% is at historical high on records. It's higher today, so 22.5%, higher than the peak observed during the British Raj. So we talked about billionaire Raj, the return of a form of extreme economic income and wealth concentration. I'll turn to wealth here. So this is the top 1% wealth share, and you see a very strong increase over the past decade or so, where the top 1% wealth share is close to 40% today, and it was actually around 33% in the 2010s, between 2012 and 2017, with small oscillations. But you see a very strong increase. Some have talked about a conclave economy or conglomerate capitalism. Well, this data gives a lot of support to these characterizations of the Indian economy. And talking about poverty, as Professor Patnaik was talking about before, well, look at this very, very stark evolution of the concentration of wealth between the bottom 50% in black and the top 1% in red. In fact, what's quite striking is that the huge level of wealth inequality observed at the global level, we also see this within countries. It's not just because there are rich and poor countries at the global level that we observe these stark inequality figures of wealth at the global level. We also see relatively similar divides within countries, and in particular in India. And so India is now, getting into the direction of being as unequal as the most unequal countries on earth, South Africa and Brazil, for instance. When we look at wealth inequalities, we're getting close to that. So these are top wealth share in historical perspective. So look at the top wealth share in India. It's higher than the US. It's getting closer to Brazil, to South Africa, and the top 10% wealth share is 65% in India today, not exactly at the level of Brazil or South Africa, but the direction, the dynamics is indeed not good. And so let me conclude by saying the following elements. Our results are likely to be conservative. In fact, there has been a lot of discussion about this data in Indian economic and policy debates. Some commentators were arguing that the data actually cannot be trusted because of this or that methodological issues. In fact, we make a lot of efforts to use the best available data with the best comparable methods out there, and we do everything in a very transparent way. So everybody who has better ideas of how to use new data sources or to contribute to this project is very much welcome to do so. But so far, we haven't seen actually any better estimates of wealth inequality that is actually consistent between what we observe on the income distribution and the wealth distribution, and consistent across these various data sources that we're using: tax data, rich lists, survey data, when we're able to access it. In fact, we're likely underestimating top wealth inequality because we don't have a full oversight of offshore wealth, for instance. And we know that from other studies that in Dubai, for instance, 20% of real estate wealth that is owned there is Indian. And this represents over 1% of India's GDP. So there's also stuff that we're missing. And even with this stuff that's missing, we have a very, very stark inequality picture. And now to conclude, how can we revert these trends? And I think this really relates to what was said before. Basically, in order to invest in the bottom half of the population, in education, in health, in making sure that these people can have, access to the economic game and can have better incomes and access some wealth, well, we need some redistribution. And I think here I would like to conclude on the historical experiment that many countries have made throughout the world in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the income scale in European countries was 1 to 100, between the bottom 50% and the top 0.1% of the distribution. This scale was reduced to 1 to 10 today. So this is a huge compression of incomes, of the income scale in European countries, for instance. This was achieved through progressive taxation financing equal access to basic services, progressive taxation of income and progressive taxation of inheritance flows, as was said before. With this, these countries were able to invest in their basic services, education, health infrastructures, and to generate a lot of economic activity at the same time. So everybody who says that, in fact, if you tax the rich more, this will be a failure for the economy, this will be bad for innovation, they are not looking at economic history well. In fact, they are blind to this historical experiment made by rich countries in the 20th century, where they combine prosperity with massive income inequality compression and social justice. So I think that this is the direction to be taken by India, but also other countries in the 21st century, looking at inheritance taxes, also looking at wealth taxes. And alas, unfortunately, what I saw very recently on the Indian political discussion with the overhaul of the MG and Rega scheme is likely to be a continuation and exacerbation of the trends that I've just discussed and observed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lucas. You will be with us for a little while more because there will be some questions. Please continue to be with us. I'll now request Jayati to take the floor. Jayati's contribution, to the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality provides a meaningful menu of options to reduce inequality at the national level. So over to you, and if you could touch on the overall of Manrega, which is also,
Yes.
Hitting us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As you know, it's first of all, let me say what a pleasure and privilege it is to be here and to follow these speakers. I'm really happy also that I'm following Luca because you presented such a good, comprehensive analysis that we can just use what you've said to develop it further. The points that both Professor Patnaik and Luca have made are really about the fact that you have to recognize this thing to do something about it. So perhaps the first problem we have in India is actually the lack of recognition. And I say this because at the G20 meeting in South Africa, where in fact I was able to be present in the meeting, the Indian delegation involved all the other, informed all the other participants that not only have we brought absolute poverty down to below 5%, as Professor Patnaik mentioned, but we are now the fourth least unequal country in the world, or rather the fourth most equal country in the world. I don't know what data they have manufactured from where to derive that result, but they announced this to all the other G20 members. The interesting thing also is that countries like South Africa and Brazil, which have much higher inequality, as Lucas has shown, recognize the problem. They say we are unequal countries. President Ramaphosa says, I set up this committee because we are really concerned about inequality in South Africa and, of course, the global aspect. And we want to do something about it. And President Lula said something very, very similar. So they recognize the problem. And if you don't recognize the problem, you're unlikely to actually either be able to, but certainly want to do anything about it. I think the fact that Luca mentioned, he was being much more polite about the absence of data, or shall we say the opacity of our data. But we now know that pretty much most of our official data cannot be trusted. Even the National Sample Survey, it's not just that they're non-comparable with the earlier surveys, but the way the questioning has changed, the way, it's basically all designed to produce particular results. We have had in the past at least some independent assessments from international agencies. Those are now being so actively pressurized by the Indian government, and I know this from people who work in these international organizations, that they get weekly, sometimes daily phone calls demanding a change in the measurements. And they've achieved it. They've got the World Bank to announce that our poverty has fallen. The ILO is under tremendous pressure. I don't even want to go there because they are questioning some of the way in which the labor force surveys are conducted. The Food and Agriculture Organization has a measurement of the proportion of population that can afford the minimal nutritious diet. And they do this according to different regions. So South Asia is one particular region. And according to their last reliable estimate, about 72% of the Indian population could not afford the nutritious diet that the FAO mentioned, very much along the lines that Professor Patnaik had been talking about, if you'd go only by calorie definitions. The FAO has been under huge pressure, and I'm reliably informed that next year we're going to see a dramatic reduction in this proportion, that in fact it's going to be possibly less than 30% who cannot afford the nutritious diet, maybe even lower, who knows, because of the massive pressure put on international agencies. And we now know that international agencies, like governments of supposedly rich and powerful countries, are very susceptible to bullying. Yeah, we've seen that in many other geopolitical frameworks, so this is hardly a surprise. What that means then is that some of the things that we had identified in the report that we were presenting, which are much less likely to be achievable in the Indian context within this political configuration. Okay, I mean, it doesn't mean that they're never, obviously, but that right now we have to really think of very, very significant changes in how we assess the available official data, how the international organizations that produce data based on the Indian government's kinds of assessments then, support particular things. We are getting a much dimmer view of the reality. We still have some power or ability to make sense of it, and I think the World Inequality Lab has been absolutely fantastic. I really want to commend Luca and Toma and the team. They've done an incredible job. There's one aspect of the report you didn't touch on. Look, I wish you had. It's really interesting, and I think it would be of great interest to everyone here as well, which is the issue of what you called the exorbitant privilege. I think you all know about the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar, right? It's the fact that the US holds the global reserve currency, can pretty much print money, do what it likes, get away with huge deficits without any problem, etc. One aspect of that is that the returns on the investments that US capitalists make abroad is much higher than what the returns of foreign investors in US assets. Okay? And that difference economists call the seigniorage cost. It's the advantage of being the seigneur, if you like. Those seigniorage costs are very high for the US, and the converse is true for developing countries. But what this report shows, and based on research by the World Economy Lab economists, is that it's also true for other rich countries. In other words, it's not just a US exorbitant privilege, it's the rich world's exorbitant privilege. European countries as a whole, Japan, etc., are all beneficiaries. That is, they all get very significant seigniorage gains, like huge relative to GDP. Conversely, developing countries, India, even China, but certainly all the BRICS countries, Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, but pretty much all of the others, we get seigniorage losses. In the Indian case, it comes to, I think, anywhere between 2 to 4% of GDP over the entire period. In the Thai case, it's between 5 and 6% of GDP. Every year, we are losing that much because of having open capital markets. Because our investors in the assets abroad are getting much lower returns than the investors based in those countries when they invest here, because we have higher interest rates, we have to give risk premia, etc., etc. Okay, that is another very interesting part of this report. I really do recommend all of you to go and look at this. Now, what this suggests is that one of the reasons why there is so much inequality is, in fact, these open capital accounts. The fact that we have capital market integration, financial liberalization, integrating with global capital markets that has made us prey to these movements, and the fact that our internal inequality then allows our elites to stash their money abroad, sometimes to avoid taxes or all kinds of other things, but in general for various, what do they call, financial prudence, yeah, to preserve their assets and such like. And that comes back to, if you like, the drivers of inequality. And so one part of our report was concerned with the drivers. And what is really remarkable is that whichever way we tried to push it, and we consulted a lot of people who said, there are these other systemic features, there's demography, there's climate, there's all of these other things. We kept coming back to the policy drivers. In other words, the policy drivers dominate. And I think that is what Luca also suggested when he said inequality is a political choice. And these policy drivers include a whole range of things broadly along the lines of what we have earlier, we're used to be calling the whole package of neoliberal economic policies. But certainly the financial liberalization and capital market integration and state protection of financial assets. I want to keep reiterating that. It's not just that you liberalize, but when that liberalization leads to a big crisis, the state steps in to protect the financial assets which benefit the very rich. Another important finding in their report, only 15% of the world's population holds capital. So when you're protecting financial assets, you're not protecting the people, you are protecting a very, very small group. Yeah? And so that's one aspect of the policy drivers of the inequality. Then there is, of course, all of the other aspects of deregulation. It's the fancy way of putting it is that you're making, labor markets more flexible. What it really means is you're denying workers protection. Okay, You deregulate with respect to health, or a whole range of requirements essential. You deregulate with respect to environment. I mean, why do we have this incredible pollution? It's not just a thermal plant, or it's all kinds of other things. You deregulate in a whole range of areas that allow private profitability and short-term gains rather than basic survival, basic conditions for the people and developmental possibilities. Of course, related to that is inadequate public provision. So it's not just that you've deregulated health, education, and all these sectors with lots of asymmetric information that allow exploitation, but that you're not providing the public option in good quality and sufficient quantity, which also, by the way, reduces employment because these are very employment-intensive sectors. And along with that, we then enable the massive increase in what you could call rents rather than profits. And rents result from monopoly power, from the ability to raise prices beyond what they deserve to be raised, from intellectual property rights that grant not just monopolies, but control over knowledge and its dissemination, from various other regulatory practices, which are all policy choices. So in a sense, when you look at what has to be done, I mean, it's kind of obvious. You have to undo those policy choices, right? You have to go the reverse of what you have been doing. And so we have a whole range of things in which we've talked about how it is possible to go back on these. And they are not that difficult. They seem like they are impossible because we have got so attuned to saying, well, these things have to exist. Intellectual property rights, patent regimes are suddenly written in stone, whereas really they're only about 25 years old in that deep and extensive sense. The ways in which, you cannot tax wealth. Luca was pointing to that. And the point that Professor Patnaik made about taxing just a very small portion. Remember, when we talk about wealth tax, people come back and say, it happened before the last elections, if you remember. The ruling party said, they're going to enter your house. If you have 2 cows, they will take 1 cow, etc. It's very important to emphasize that this is all about taxing extreme wealth. It is not about taxing even middle class. Now, in fact, property tax is paid by middle class, by lower middle class, etc., etc. It's taken for granted. But financial wealth, there are endless ways. And of course, wealth taxes do not exist. But there are endless ways to avoid paying taxes out of the incomes from financial assets, which is why the wealthy in our country pay next to no tax, just like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and others pay no income tax either. So the solution is for that definitely to have a wealth tax, a 2% wealth tax, a global minimum wealth tax is a proposal that has been made and is being discussed in many countries of the world, has been implemented in some countries as well. I just want to mention very quickly the example of Colombia, a middle-income country, currently, of course, also being threatened by Mr. Trump, which managed to institute a wealth tax on its extreme wealthy. What they did was to say everybody who holds more than $50 million in known assets. And known assets is usually only financial and property. So we don't know about their resources and the gold and the paintings and the stuff like that. But at least what you do know. And it was a tax instituted on that wealth wherever it is held, which is now possible because of the fact that there is automatic exchange of banking information. And so you can actually track. Now, that one measure in Colombia affected very few people, a few thousand people. And it generated a 0.75% of GDP in tax. Doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a lot. In India, if we did this to the top 1,000 families, we would generate 2% of GDP, which I would like to remind you is more than double the total public health spending of central and state governments taken together. That's the kind of thing we are missing out on. The point is really this, is that the reason why that curve, that massive increase in wealth at the very top matters so much is not just because of the fact that it reduces the possibilities for poverty reduction and enabling social and economic rights and so on, but because extreme wealth brings extreme power. And extreme power means you can control laws, regulations, policies, institutions in ways that further increase your wealth and your power. And it's really that which we have to fight. Many pronged ways of fighting it through regulation, through policy change, and also through taxation. But I think all of those have to be done because otherwise we're in this really crazy spiral of massively increasing inequality with extreme, unbelievable wealth at the top, not just nationally, but globally. Look, I don't know if you have seen this, but there is a UBS report on wealth which is got released today. And I was quite struck by it. It's only based on 58 countries, so it's much more limited than their report. But it covers the OECD countries and the BRICS countries and some of these. According to them, in 2024, 15 individuals, 10 plus 5 individuals, held $2.35 trillion, which amounted to 15% of the total wealth of all of that. Yeah? 15 people. If you take 2,860 individuals, they held 12.2 trillion in wealth, which was 78% of the wealth of that entire sample. So we have now reached global, we have the greatest concentration of wealth and power in human history, I believe. And that has very dystopic consequences. So it is clearly something that has to become a dramatic and major source of public mobilization and demand for change. Stop here, thanks.
Thank you very much. So can we I'll put the questions?
Yeah, Luca first.
Yeah, Luca, can you take up or any questions addressed to Luca? Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Luca, one of our professor, Arun Kumar from JNU also, he said the data of census is not available and the calculation of GDP is also not is fudging. It says less than 48%. If we say 8% is less than around 4%. And at the same time, when Prime Minister claims he is offering free food to 81 crore, 800 million people, it's so obvious that 60% people even don't have food. If you go by that figure, 70% don't have clothes, 80% don't have house. So these figures are very obvious. And how we can say these figures are not valid? Even Prime Minister himself is saying, for 5 years we are going to offer free food. So these figures are very much obvious. So why not to accept this figure in such a way that this poverty and equality at the same time in our neighborhood, such a youth protest is going on for unemployment in Bangladesh, in India itself also a huge unemployment. People go for a peer job, doctor, engineer, BTech, MTech. All these figures are available. So can you make some comment about it?
Can we take in 2 more questions, then you can come in? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ravi Bhuthalingam. My question is to you, Luca. I can't see you because I'm facing the other way.
I can see you.
Okay. So you talked about wealth tax, and so did Jayati. So my question is this. One of the arguments used against wealth tax is that the wealthy then move jurisdiction from the tax levying authority, and mobility of capital being what it is, it goes away, and therefore you are deprived of the tax. So what does the evidence say, particularly from rich countries like Norway, Sweden, etc., where this is being implemented? What does the evidence say about the veracity of this observation and its impact, if any? Thank you.
Just take one more, and then Luca can. Is there anybody more? No. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for these 2 very important points. So on the data point, what we're saying about data opacity is For instance, one important source of information that we had been using in the past is tax data. And we have all India income tax statistics available since 1922 up to 1998. But then some of you may have read this paper by Banerjee and Piketty mobilizing this tax data, and suddenly this data disappeared because it already started to show the reversion of the income inequality curve. Income inequality had been declining from the 50s to the 80s, and then started to rise again. Then we managed in a way to access, kind of miraculously in a way, but I think there was this live debate between Thomas Piketty and Arvind Subramanian at the time, who actually live was kind of compelled to say, okay, we will release a new set of tax data, which happened, and which we mobilized to publish our 2017 paper on Indian income inequality. And after we released this paper, well, access to tax data started to disappear again. And so that's where we are at. There has been a more recent release over the very recent periods, but it was released retrospectively, and we still don't have the micro files. It's so it's becoming harder and harder to access this data, and it's important, to have a good picture of what's happening at the bottom, but also at the very top of the distribution. And tax data makes it much easier to track what is happening at the top in a more systematic way. So that's what we are referring to. Now, wealth tax and capital flight. So what does the evidence say? The evidence says that, in fact, the discussion is completely out of size as compared to the reality of the impact. So basically, when we look at increases in capital taxation in European countries, or reductions in wealth taxes, because as you know, there have been several experiments of wealth taxes in France, in some Scandinavian countries, and some of these taxes were removed afterwards. Do we see people coming back home when the wealth tax is scrapped? Do we see people fleeing when the tax rates are increased? We do see a little bit of movement, but which is actually extremely small. In particular, very small as compared to the size of this argument in public discussions, and in particular in those who oppose wealth taxation. So it's not something that we can completely disregard, but it's clearly something that has been engineered and used to prevent any kind of serious discussion, objective discussion about the benefits of a wealth tax. That's point one. Point two, capital flight, capital movement is not a law of nature. It is actually a decision that legislators can make to limit it. For instance, the US have an exit tax, which means that potentially for life, you will have to pay taxes to your home country, wherever you are. Even if you change your tax residence. In many countries, there's no such exit tax. And I think that maybe, being liable to paying taxes for life in a given country might be a little long, but maybe for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, this can be, a good mix in order to really prevent the little, tax residency change that you might still observe when you implement a wealth tax. So bottom line, from what we observe, it's much lower than what is typically discussed. And second, it's not a law of nature. There are also measures like exit taxes. When people change their domiciliation for tax optimization or evasion purposes, you can also actually tax them. So that's my two answers. Thank you so much. I really need to go, but it was a pleasure to discuss and to speak with you all today.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thanks for joining. Thanks. So I wanted to put a question to Professor Patnaik. See, there's a link between the kind of majoritarianism and economic justice. I mean, the way things are going. Could you elaborate, because you have talked about this very often, but how is it now panning out?
I basically go back to the 1930s because you had a big crisis. In a big crisis, I think the legitimacy of the hegemony of big capital is something which comes into question. And I think today we are in a very similar situation with unemployment growing everywhere in the world. And you find this majoritarianism, or some call it neo-fascism, as a global tendency. It's not just confined to particular countries. You find it in Argentina, you find in the US, you find emergence of it in France and Germany, and you find it in Turkey. Israel, of course, is a very, very extreme case of it. You find it everywhere. So the emergence of the global tendency towards majoritarianism and towards, if you like, neo-fascism is something, to my mind, is linked to the crisis of neoliberalism, which is confronting us. This crisis of neoliberalism makes itself felt in very many different ways. One way it is making its presence felt is through Trump's tariffs, which are a form of beggar thy neighbor policy, that basically is a form of exporting unemployment. Now, Trump may succeed or not, that's a separate issue, but it's a way of pursuing beggar thy neighbor policies, which is the kind of policies which had been pursued in the 1930s through competitive exchange rate depreciations. So it's a way of diverting people's attentions away from the economic reality that they face towards blaming the other, otherizing a minority. It could be immigrants, it could be some ethnic minority, it could be a religious minority, but this is a tendency that you find all over. And I think this tendency is related, to my mind, with the crisis of neoliberalism.
In this very room some years back, we were having a discussion on the state of the Indian economy. And a gentleman who was here, of course, not a member, hopefully, of IIC, he raised the point of, unless you tackle the Muslim vegetable sellers, nothing is going to change. I mean, we had to kind of shoo him out of the room. But what I'm just saying is that the kind of, thinking, the kind of, craziness which is hanging around. Now, I would like to ask Jayati if you could elaborate on whether what kind of overall of Manrega taking place, how will it impact the situation in the rural economy?
I mean, I think what has been happening with the effective destruction of Manrega and the VG Ramji or whatever it is, they want to call it G Ramji. It's actually VBG Ramji. Is a disaster, obviously, for many reasons. But I want to go back to this issue about, what the government is doing. And essentially, if you think about it, what the government is really focused on is perception management. And to a very large extent, they are successful. And in so many ways, you mentioned free food. I mean, let's face it, it was 2 rupees a kilo, 10 rupees a month for 5 kilos. That is the same as free. But what he does is he says, I will make it free. And now everybody says Modi ji has given free food. 2 rupees and 0 rupees, there's really not much difference. But the ability to manage perceptions, to create this thing that, Modi ji ne khana diya, is really part of the thing. What is happening with this new scheme is precisely that. We will give you 125 days. In fact, it's actually the opposite. Because what they have done is remove the fact that the central government would cover 90% of the expenditure, often more than that, because they would cover all the labor costs. And instead, it will be like any other central scheme where these states have to provide 40% of the cost. To maintain the existing levels of employment, state governments would have to shell out anywhere between 2 to 26% of their budget, total budget. That's just to maintain the existing level of employment, which has never reached 100 days for every worker. for every household. It's been in the range of 45 to 50 max. Okay, there are about 8% of households who have got 100 days of work. So the idea that you're going to give everybody 125 is wrong. Number two, this scheme actually limits the, I mean, it's no longer a right. It's basically the government, the central government will decide where, within which, not just districts, within which taluk that scheme will apply, in which year. So it may be this year in this taluk in this state. Next year, it may not be here at all. It's entirely up to the decision of the central government. And the promise will be for 125 days, but for that, the state government will have to shell out 40%, not knowing whether this scheme will actually even continue into the next year. The shelf of works will be decided by the central government, in which contractors are allowed, and it can be merged with other schemes. What is going to happen is that a whole range of other public spending is going to be classified as this VB Ramji, and the Narega as we know it is going to disappear. This has been a lifeline for Indian people. It's 20 years of this, and pretty much all governments realized. Modi himself, when he came to power, he said it's a monument to the failures, realized he could not get rid of it. Because, in fact, too many state governments said, no, we will not survive without this. And it was proved throughout different crises, the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, the pandemic period. There was a dramatic rise in need from urban migrants going back to villages who said, you know, without any jobs, who needed that support in addition to the rural distress. But also remember, this was actually a major, not just lifeline for workers, but a very significant shift in bargaining power for women workers and for previously marginalized Dalits, scheduled tribes, etc. All of that has gone. We now it's a free-for-all. We're back to that earlier situation, which is a situation of extreme rural distress. And I am actually, I mean, we know that our capitalist class is incredibly supine and servile and so on. But I'm surprised that they are not reacting, because it really means that whatever little domestic market they had managed to get in rural India is over. So it's a really, really major move. Yeah.
Yeah, please take the mic. Yeah, just Liz, just identify yourself.
We didn't hear you, sorry.
No, on, put it on. Yeah.
It is on. Oh. Liz Matthew, I work with Indian Express. I have a question. Like, you know, this NREGS scheme's importance or significance was also, it's like you work and earn. Like, there is a sense of dignity there. And now, with the new policies, what we have been seeing is like you are free to shell out money for and funds for free. Like, you know, that you are ready to give 10,000 or like, you know, 4,500, whatever is the amount. But you are cutting the scheme which is giving a dignity. Like, what is the idea behind? What's that concept of, you know, giving free but taking away, or like, you know, reducing funds for a scheme for which the rural people or the poor people had, like, you know, they felt dignified about it. You work and earn. So what you think about it, and why I don't know why no one is, even in parliament I listened to through the debate over the name change and the schemes modification, but no one spoke about that. Why do you think that, you know, this government wants to give free? I know, of course, you said one point about that, you know, that narrative setting. Other than that, what is that?
It's essentially to move away from a rights-based approach. This is a very anti-rights government. I mean, you know, all the things that Professor Patnaik mentioned are really things they cannot abide. Its citizens only have duties. They don't have rights in this scheme. And everything is a gift of Sarkar. It will be Modi ji ne diya hai. Just like they give you, Modi ji gives us vaccines. We're the only country in the world that had his picture on the vaccine certificate, which was therefore most other countries said, no, this can't be a real certificate because it doesn't have your face on it. Right? So I'm saying the way this government operates is to deny the notion of citizens' rights. And instead to say, whatever we give you is a gift from us. And as long as we are in power, we can choose to give it to you. And of course, double engine sarkar is even more so. We will prevent any other opposition party from giving it to you. We may choose to give it to you. So you better keep voting for us.
I just add something to that. You see, the two questions which which Mr. Borker asked me about neo-fascism. I believe it has a number of characteristics. One, of course, is very close link between the government and big capital. The other is a very close link, particularly with a segment of big capital and the government, which we observe. The third is, of course, the extreme authoritarianism. The fourth is the letting loose of hoodlums in society at large in order to target the minority groups. And one very important component of it, I mean, the othering of the minority, and one very important component of it is building up the cult of the leader. The more you deny rights to the people, the more you can build up the cult of the leader as the benevolent person who is actually disposing of all these largesse. So it's really the two are very closely related.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Professor Patnaik. I mean, I think you've rightly argued that there should be some fundamental economic rights, but how do you actually ensure employment? That's one. The second is to both of you. Um, what do you say about the fact that Manrega is being destroyed, coupled with the fact that there are labor codes? Is it true that industry will have cheap labor? And if that is the case, then again, how do you create employment? That's a fundamental. And only I want to make a point. I'm a lawyer. It's very well to talk about economic rights, but realization of that is very, very, very difficult, especially in a developing country. I mean, I would love if there are rights like that, employment, but how do you achieve them? That's a fundamental, not only an economic issue, but a legal rights issue.
Which is why I said that the right to employment, I mean, obviously, the right to employment must have as a clause that in case the state does not succeed in providing employment, the person should be paid a full wage. In other words, that takes the responsibility of providing, that puts the responsibility of providing employment on the state. If I am unemployed, it's not my fault. It's the fault of a society to which I belong that cannot find a job for me. Okay, that's the basic principle behind it. And that being the case, I believe in such a case you should actually have the payment of a full wage. And of course, when you have all these payments, they would generate a demand. You see, it's not as if you start employing people. You put purchasing power in the hands of the people, and when you do that, then they demand goods, and when they demand goods, then you actually find greater employment. And if you put purchasing power in the hands of the poor, in that case, the kind of goods they demand are much more employment intensive, and that is something that would actually enlarge employment.
Yeah, I understand and I agree with you. But I'm asking you, have you done any studies to show that it is actually feasible in terms of if there's no employment, you can actually guarantee what you call a full wage? Is the national income going to grow so much? I mean, this is a very big issue.
But our calculation showed that even at the current moment, with a 2% wealth tax and 1/3 inheritance tax, you would be able to finance these rights.
I just want to add to that. What we had used as the right to work was effectively a rural employment guarantee, the existing one, 100 days of work, and an urban employment guarantee. In other words, we had taken a very restrictive notion. We had said only 100 days of work. But no, I know it's not right. At the minimum wage, yes. 100 days of work per person, we had said, not per household, per person, per adult, rural and urban. So it was a larger scheme than the existing scheme, but it wasn't a complete right in that sense. But definitely the economics of this is very sound. It's the old Keynesian idea that the more you spend and put in the hands of those that are likely to spend more, you will get higher multiplier effects, which will generate more economic activity and employment. And the studies on Narega have found multipliers of between 3 and 6 just in the local area, in the district. So, it's not inconceivable that you would need to do less and less of it over time.
Question was slightly different. Can I? No, I wanted to ask, what is your reaction to the argument that, in fact, Manrega has been destroyed to actually make sure there's cheap labor available in the urban areas? That's an argument being positive.
There's the
I
question
mean,
of
I did the-
prioritization of the marginal
I-
farmers.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably what they believe, but they're completely mistaken. Labor is already incredibly cheap in India. It cannot get cheaper. And that is not what is holding back investment. What is holding back investment is lack of demand. The fact that we persist, as policymakers persist in seeing labor costs as cost rather than as a source of domestic demand, that's one of the big problems. So yes, that's what they're thinking, but they're wrong. They're misplaced. It's a bit like thinking we'll reduce the tax rate on corporate profits and they will invest more. In fact, they invested less.
Hi. I'm a lawyer, so my question may seem a bit amateurish. But historically, haven't there been long periods of time across the globe when there has been a large concentration of both wealth and power in very few hands? Perhaps comparable to what the situation is now. Now, obviously, inequality is a bad thing, and progress has to be in a direction where there is a more democratic distribution of wealth and opportunity. But isn't it the case that in all of those ways of being or modes of production, there had to be violent revolution in order for there to be change? Now, if that's the case, wouldn't that have to be how things might change now? And an incremental tweaking of the system might actually be impossible, given how much power this very small minority of people have over how laws are made and the distribution system is envisaged and implemented. There'd have to be violent revolution to bring about any kind of change.
No,
Very proud.
you see, the whole point, why are we discussing this here? The whole point of this entire discussion is, if possible, to prevent such a violent revolution by, in fact, bringing about the changes which might actually forestall a violent revolution. Okay, I mean, if the Kerensky government had distributed land, there would be no Bolshevik revolution. Or if the Kerensky government had actually, withdrawn from the war, there'd be no Bolshevik revolution. So it is precisely when governments are intransigent that you actually have the whole issue of a violent revolution coming on the agenda. And we always try, therefore, to try and prevent such violence by bringing about changes if possible. I mean, that's the whole idea.
Isn't the other thing we've learned that, I mean, I don't know if it's a necessary condition because, there are many different cases, but it's not a sufficient condition. That we know. A violent revolution is not a sufficient condition for a more egalitarian society to emerge.
Can I just raise one point, ma'am? Actually, in 1945, in 1945, when Gandhi wrote his constructive program, second point was economic equality. He said, a violent and bloody revolution would be a certainty if economic inequality persists. That's what if it's as early as 45.
Yes. My question is about, inequality within poverty and also the regional pattern. So when, let's say, I'm not entering into the debate of whether there is increasing poverty or not. We know that there are different views on it. But taking for granted what Prabhat, the data which he gave us, within that, Prabhat, what is the picture? How unequal is the situation spread across states, like North versus South, regional patterns? What are the patterns we see? And also from the Manrega data, what is the kind of picture that we get of internal differentiation? Maybe I'm using the wrong word just provocatively, but what is the differentiation in levels of poverty that we get from different kinds of data?
No, I mean, I think there is there are noticeable differences across states. Kerala obviously has much lower levels of poverty. Uh, Even Tamil Nadu may have lower levels of poverty. So, but compared, for instance, to the Bimaru states, which would have much higher levels of poverty. Okay, there is you see, in Kerala, there used to be a belief that there was no poverty. In fact, in Kerala, even now, there is talk that extreme poverty has disappeared. I don't know if it has, but the point is that, that's very difficult to answer. That question is very difficult to answer. But the point is that it is certainly true that there are significant differences between states when it comes to the extent of poverty. Punjab would have less poverty and so on. But beyond that, I wouldn't be able to say.
No, I was asking this because
Can you press the key?
one of the arguments that one has been hearing recently is the sharp increase in different in rates of growth and all other indicators between many of the states of the south and many of the states of the north. I mean, that's a generalization. But so I was wondering that how does this get reflected in the situation when we are talking about poverty? Does it affect that
No.
significantly or it doesn't?
No, I'm not sure that it has anything to do with the state level growth rates, because actually, when you look at official data, Bihar is at a very high rate of growth. Okay, yeah. And Kerala, comparatively in that sense, would have a lower rate of growth compared, let's say, to Gujarat or something like that. But on the other hand, Kerala has has reduced poverty significantly. I wouldn't say got rid of. So it is a lot to do with policies, which is what Jayati was saying.
And just to add to that, the trouble is really that the NSS consumption survey data we cannot trust. According to that, though, poverty in the southern states is really, really much lower. In fact, but if you take other indicators, which are probably, life expectancy, nutrition indicators, maternal mortality, child mortality, stunting, etc., the southern states are way ahead in general. Kerala was always way ahead. Tamil Nadu has shown the most dramatic improvement. Telangana is not far behind. So, there is definitely all of that happening in the southern states.
And I'll add to what you ask. There's one question I have. So you quickly go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Anurag. I'm a graduate student in anthropology. My question is about the political program for the policies that you talked about, a 10% additional increase in expenditure. Is there a world in which the current arrangement between the state and the capitalists moves towards, let's say, an agrarian capitalist, and we can get this extra 10% expenditure? My question is like Pranab Bardhan said, there are different groups within the capitalist class in India. So therefore, can a political party do what it wants to do by ignoring the Adanis and the Ambanis and the big capitalists and choosing another section within the capitalist class?
The little thing about the policy failures in taxation. You have the ultra rich often pay lower effective taxes than the middle class groups, and then the second part is billionaires and centi-millionaires avoid tax through loopholes. They pick up the toppers of the Indian Revenue Service and pay them fantastic amounts because they know the loopholes, and that's how they get away with it.
I find all such discussion, which we used to have in the 70s and so on, about class differentiation within the peasantry and so on, somewhat outdated now. Because actually now, since neoliberalism has come, the dominance of agribusiness, multinational agribusiness, the dominance of big capital, the dominance of the Adanis and so on and so forth is so great that even the so-called rich peasants in agricultural sector, for instance, during the peasant agitation, which was supported by the left, a lot of people used to say, what is this? They have tractors. They belong to the kind of emerging proto-bourgeoisie and so on. So how can the left support them? I think all that debate, to some extent, we have to go beyond. Okay. And that being the case, I would say that such a program of the kind that we have been talking about requires the support not only of the workers, who are very limited now in India, but of the peasantry above all, and of petty producers, craftsmen, washermen, fishermen, and so on. So I think if you can actually, I believe if you can carry to them the conviction that a government can come to power that can give these rights, it can have the same kind of impact that Indira Gandhi's Garibi Hatao had. And if so, then you can actually do a number of things. First of which would have to be capital controls. Okay.
Just to add to that, it's definitely, I mean, a time for worker peasant alliance, kind of, as you were saying, including rich peasantry, but also actually the middle bourgeoisie. Because, what we haven't mentioned so far is another aspect of the inequality. 90% of corporate profits goes to the top 100 companies. Can you imagine? So forget, even other large companies are not getting it, right? Middle enterprises and small enterprises are also being bashed along with the micro and own account workers. Half of our workers are self-employed, which means they are actually supposedly entrepreneurs. But all the medium and small are also being massively bashed throughout this period, whether they're formal or informal. So there is a real scope for alliance that pick up on all of these. Yeah.
Can I just mention one fact very briefly? When I became an associate professor in JNU in 1973, the starting basic salary of an associate professor was 700 rupees per month. Today, the starting basic salary of an associate professor in a central university is, I believe, 1,75,000 rupees a month. 150,000 rupees a month. Associate. 1,50,000 rupees a month. Yeah, which means it is at least gone up 200 times. When I got 700 rupees a month, the procurement price of wheat was 75 rupees a quintal. Today is 2,250 or some such thing, 1:30. So that even relative to an academic, and academics in India are not a particularly pampered lot, even relative to an academic, the peasants have done much worse.
About the tax evasion, absolutely. I mean, part of the problem, of course, is that we do not have regulations that require trusts and companies to reveal beneficial owners. And this is a very basic and simple thing. So many countries have done it. I'm sure, you will all agree that it's the most minimal thing you have to do if you want to identify where the wealth is and how it's being transferred and whether it's being moved across companies in ways, etc., etc. There is a separate problem about the offshore. But even within the country, we have so many trusts and so many of these other things that enable massive legal loopholes. And yes, of course, the rich are able to take advantage of it.
I think we've had a very interesting discussion. Good things, bad things have to come to a close. So so thank you all very much, and we look forward to the next keys to governance on the 7th of January 2027. Okay, thank you very much.